SportsLit is co-founded and co-hosted by Neil Acharya and Nate Sager. Technical producer and engineer, Michael Ella. Executive producer, Neil Acharya.
Hey, Dr. Madeleine Orr is here to discuss her book, Warming Up, How Climate Change is Changing Sport. The title was released May 14th, 2024 by Bloomsbury Press, with Raincoast Books handling the distribution in Canada. Orr is a sport ecologist and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the kinesiology and physical education department, and she studies the effects of climate change and extreme heat on athletes. And I am Nathan Sager. As we gird for another hottest summer of your life, so far, Dr. Madeleine Orr has authored a book I have wanted to read for years. I love sports. Addendum to that, there is no planet B. So, as the world burns, my mind often goes to the question or addresses in Warming Up. How do we better size sports in a low-carbon world? No, hey, come back. It's not that esoteric. I mean, do you also do a what about the environment wince when North American sports leagues send teams overseas for regular season games using a lot of that kerosene burning jet fuel, or when there are big Olympic and international events that have a lot of people traveling to watch the games, such as the Copa America, Euro 2024, and Paris 2024 Olympics, all happening this summer. And do you also have that similar wince whilst thinking about how people have to drive their children to their intensely over-organized youth sports? I can tell you all of that is on loop in my head, along with Orr's aphorism that heat is big bad. So with the book, Warming Up, How Climate Change is Changing Sport, talk about timely, eh? Orr covers a lot of scorched, parched earth. It's an upbeat book, I promise you, as someone who has read it and become a fan of her work. Or makes the case for needing sports while playing catch-up with climate change. Now, what do we need to do sports? Well, clean air, drinking water, relief from the heat. Ain't it a coinky-dink that we also need those to live? Now, people tend to glaze a bit when climate change comes up these days. It's an understandable human reaction because the scope of climate change is dizzying. Girls and women also represent 4 in 5 people displaced by extreme weather. Women are also 14 times more likely to die from it than men. So you have to read gendering into it, and the media still struggles with that, and we struggle with that. The acceleration of climate change, maybe it looks like you're sitting in front of your TV and you have 2 full-court pro basketball games laid over each top of each other, like they're happening in the same arena, and they're both using 2 balls, and the shot clock is 12 seconds instead of 24. However, after reading Orr, I think the better description is that it's more like a hockey game. It's very fast, happening at a very fast pace, but it's all about all these little 50-50 battles in these corners, and you try to win as many of them as you can, and you work as a team, and that hopefully achieves the goal and leads to the W. None of that comes easily, but like I say, it's in every corner of our life. Here in Hamilton, Ontario, where I live, for instance, there's a group of people, they've been pushing for years to have a bylaw regulating the maximum heat in apartments during the summer, which is Southern Ontario gets very hot in the summer. They point out that this would actually probably lead to savings for an overburdened healthcare system because prolonged exposure to heat exacerbates many medical conditions. It's a slow killer, as we saw in British Columbia in 2021 with the heat dome. This group, they won over the Board of Health just the other day about expanding a grant program that helps people with low incomes and severe medical conditions purchase room conditioners. It took a whole 0.3% out of a climate change reserve fund the city already has. It's a human-centered right-centered approach. And you know what? There was still backlash about it. Now, in warming up, Orr does not finger-wag about our habits. And I think the book really points up that sports people and athletes are often ahead of their senior leadership. Why do they know about the effects of exerted people sucking in heavily fouled air? Well, because they literally are doing it right now. A Canadian example would be the CFL players who played a game in Calgary last year as wildfire smoke drifted over the city. They were literally breathing in where sports ecosystems must, to borrow the title of John Shannon's 22 memoir, evolve or die. The athletes just want the leaders to, quote, from Orr, rethink the way sports operates. The author and academic mentions, World Cup skiers calling on their sports overseers to get more serious about saving the snow on the mountains. There's race car drivers who want the Formula One schedule to be organized in a way that will incorporate less travel. Or brings up the instance of an English runner, Innes Fitzgerald, who refused to attend a world championship because it meant a long-haul flight to Australia. And I think I read that Fitzgerald had a 30-hour journey by train to compete in an event in Europe this year. Now, in the global south, did you see Mexico just elected a Nobel Peace Prize winning climate scientist, Claudia Sheinbaum, as president? There's instances now of athletes saying, we're not going to wear oil company logos on our uniforms, so you're going to have to get different sponsors. By the way, share that with the new Calgary Wild women's pro soccer team, whose sponsor will be, you guessed it, an oil and gas firm. Now, I'm going to obviously still support a women's soccer league in Canada, but also, come on, Calgary, shame on you. May you lose every road game. You can still win or tie at home. I'm not a monster. There's been a lot of commentary, and I'm just using these as examples of how people are starting to pick up on this new reality. There was a lot of commentary about the travel distance involved in hockey's Stanley Cup final between Edmonton and Florida, but I didn't hear too much about a format change that would reduce the number of airplane flights. So I know for me, having recently kind of, it's a supplemental reading to warming up, I read A Good War by Seth Klein, and I read Fire Weather by John Vaillant. Those showed that the public is ahead of the powerful on understanding the need for climate action. In fact, I think you can go all the way back in 2006, an American politician said, America's addicted to oil. You know who that was? President George W. Bush, a Republican. He got it. Now, Orr's pursuit of sports ecology was twigged about a decade ago. She was working at a ski resort in the French Alps, and she saw what the lack of snow did to the community. People lost income. That led to more mental health issues. They were using artificial snow, which China used 100% for the snow events in the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. It has a lot less give than fresh powder or the real snow. Orr saw an increase in the frequency and degree of ski injuries. So that, piqued her interest as a curious person. She's gone on to create a field of study. She's a founder and co-director of the Sport Ecology Group, or has also designed a master's program in sustainable sport business. So I think we know we're at a point where the business model of big sport is unsustainable. And degrowth is probably not in the vocab of the oligarchical operators of, the big North American leagues. But however, major pro sports have shown they can scale differently when they need to. Sports during the roughest period of the COVID-19 pandemic, well, yes, it looked dystopian on a surface level with empty arenas and cardboard cutouts of fans. But it was an example that as much as sports sells tradition and as much as sports always wants to grow, they could adapt on the fly to a public health emergency. And of course, climate change is a public health emergency. Baseball and hockey, went into bubbles so they could finish seasons. Major League Baseball played a short season with less travel because teams were divided into 3 regions. They had a neutral site World Series. The NFL played its full inventory of games, but it pared the size of a visiting team travel party from 170 to 70, almost 60%. So that kind of thinking, that sensitivity, it courses through the first 2/3 of warming up, or shows that when athletes and sports organizations, like a country club, see the effects of climate change right in the face, they make adjustments just like a team does during a game. So that's sort of the ground level of it. What I'm kind of obsessed with is what the logistics will be as we get into this low carbon future. And it's coming up real quick. And it's one where, by the way, from reading Seth Klein, I know that Canada will have to leave about 4/5 of its, quote, proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground, unquote. And by the way, that transition could create a lot of employment, just like the wartime industries did in the 1940s. Sports are definitely going to have to face reductions in airplane travel. From what I understand, the alternative to kerosene burning jet fuel, it ain't appearing on that tarmac anytime soon. And also having greener pastimes, it cannot come at the expense of the boom in women's sports. They were denied that competitive profile for far too long. Now, admittedly, on this podcast, we haven't gotten into this enough on SportsLit. We hadn't seen a book that really got into this. I know in 2022, we had Howard Bryan on for his Ricky Henderson bio. Over the years, he's written a lot about the need for change, climate-friendlier changes in sports. But it's just little areas where I see people coming into where if NHL writers on the Bird app keep mentioning the absurdity that hockey is played after May 31st. I mean, it's a sport played on ice, and it's starting in its championship series on the 8th of June. A few years ago, when people's minds were a little bit more open because there were fewer games to watch during the pandemic, a researcher named Seth Wines at Concordia University of Montreal, he showed that major pro sports could easily cut emissions by 30% with a few schedule fixes. Similarly, in Warming Up, Orr pitches a lot of material changes during the last third of the book. She is, copped to some Pollyannaism with that. But hey, a writer has to take chances. And, that can be hard when you're writing because you're so busy typing. I just hope her message reaches athletes and sports leaders in Canada. We know that changes are going to be difficult. In North America, it's going to be wild because whereas Europe, is all sort of compact looking. In North America, whether it's a century-old men's league or a women's league that's just getting going, we get hosed by the geography and weak ground transport infrastructure. Those are policy choices, by the way. I'm just imagining that sports schedules are going to look a lot different in the next 10 to 20 years. By the way, the week of this recording, for instance, the sports team I probably pay the closest attention to, the Toronto Blue Jays, they were slated to fly 5+ hours to the West Coast for a series against a non-division opponent, Oakland. And then they were going to have a 3.5-hour flight to Milwaukee, which is in the other league in another time zone. And they're still going to fly to the West Coast twice more this season. Please make that make sense. I just, for grins, typed Oakland to Milwaukee by train into Google Maps. It said it would take 63 hours. So I don't think they're going to be pulling in Innes Fitzgerald anytime soon. But would my Jays follow ship and the team's profitability suffer greatly if their regular season was all in the eastern half of North America and they played a few more games to allow for ground transport to cities like, say, Chicago or Cleveland? No, not at all. So Warming Up is definitely timely. Dr. Orr's already taken action in getting the Paris 2024 Olympics leadership to be more truthful about their carbon footprint. I think with climate change, sports, the perspiring arts are just at the tip of the spear. And that reality, I don't see it always addressed enough in mainstream media and politics. But I'll just remember what Ken Dryden wrote in the book Neil Acharya and I read for his appearance 2 months ago. As Dryden put it, the mainstream outlasts every decision maker. And sports is life. So let's bring it in. 1, 2, 3, air to breathe, out of the heat, water to drink. We'll work on that. So again, please visit sportslit.ca for our catalog and links to buy the books. The episodes with Jacob Pomrenke and Keith O'Brien seem topical right now because we talked about sports gambling. And today, MLB just gave a lifetime ban to Tucupita Marcano for gambling on games played by his organization. Who'd have seen it coming, besides everybody? And of course, the catalog now includes Warming Up, How Climate Change is Changing Sport by Dr. Madeleine Orr. Okay, we are back on SportsLit with Dr. Madeleine Orr, author of Warming Up. Madeleine, maybe right off the top, tell us about some good trouble that you stirred up recently in Paris.
Oh, no. So Paris is about to host the Olympic Games, and they have made some pretty big claims about it being sustainable, and, they're going to clean up the Seine, and they're going to do all these things. And it seems that only a small fraction of the promises are actually coming to pass on the environmental side. And even those small promises being achieved is pretty good. And I don't want to kind of I don't want to be discounting the work that's gone into some of that, but it's nowhere near at the scale that they initially said it would be. And so they've been promising things like carbon positive, et cetera. And I went on French news and said that was a bunch of nonsense. And I got into some trouble with some of the organizers, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, I think I heard you describing it was like you're in meetings and people are telling you can't say this, and then there's some maybe more younger people working with the organizing committee around your vintage were like kind of nodding and like she's right.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's like if you have the responsibility of putting on the Olympic Games, like that's a huge mantle to take. But I still think that you can't be lying to the public about what it is you're accomplishing. And if you're saying you're going to be carbon positive, like that's not a thing. That's just like the physics don't make sense. And the people on the call who are from the sustainability office and like who crunch these numbers all the time, they know that I'm right. And so they were kind of nodding along and like, yeah, this is maybe bad comms. And of course, like the comms and legal people were not pleased about this at all. But ultimately they changed it. They walked it back. And now they're saying they're going to be carbon neutral, which again, they probably won't even be that, but it's a huge step forward that they're actually considering the language around it.
How valuable do you think this book is for maybe just showing people sometimes how greenwashing and sport washing, takes place, and sometimes we're not even aware of it?
Oh, I think before I got into this space and into this research about 10 years ago, like there were so many things going over my head because as a sports fan, you tune into sports and you pay attention for the fun and for like the spectacle of it. And you're not necessarily fact checking everything they say about what's going on behind the scenes on how their operations work or, what the Zamboni is up to or whatever it is. And so it's, getting into the climate science of it and getting into the sustainability science, like has allowed me to kind of see behind the curtain. I'm hoping that the book helps people to see behind that curtain a little bit of like, here's what's actually happening behind the scenes. Some of it is good. A lot of it needs work. That's okay. That's part of the process. That's fine. But we actually have to do that process. We actually have to make some improvements here.
What was the eureka moment? I mean, you've worked in this, like I say, I heard you talk about how you sort of got interested in this around 2015, but what was sort of the eureka moment to say that there is a book length treatment here?
I think the eureka moment for me was sitting around at a dinner in Glasgow, Scotland during COP, when COP was there, the Conference of the Parties, the big kind of climate conference that happens at the end of every year. And it was in Glasgow, it was 2021. And I'm sitting there with like the editor of sustainability for BBC Sport, like a reporter from ESPN, the head of the Green Sports Alliance. Like it's a table of kind of like the who's who of sports media and different people. I don't know how I even got in there, but anyway, I was sitting at this dinner and just listening. And we started going off about stories that we've heard from just really different parts of the world. Like Pakistan's got floods, and then over in Chile, they've got air quality issues. And then over here, like in Canada, we obviously have huge fires, and this is a big problem. Like every year it's a problem. And what I started realizing is nobody's telling that joined up story. Like they're being passed off in the media as a one-off story because the media's job is to make something quick and flashy and to make it relevant to the local population. And that means that it's very easy to know kind of what's up in your little corner of the world, but not necessarily tie it together with like the bigger process of climate change and see how it fits with what other organizations might go through or what other fans in another part of the world are seeing. So that was my moment.
And how much did you just want to show that sports is no different from anything else? It's just all these I think I used the analogy. It's like a hockey game where you have to win all these little 50-50 battles, and hopefully they'll add up to you're not going to win them all. You might not even win 65% of them, but eventually those will add up to the goal, and they'll add up to the big green W in this, to totally torture the analogy.
No, but that's exactly right. And I think, when we talk about sports, there's so much language and narrative in sports that makes sense for climate change, right? Like you named it, it's these 50-50 little battles. They all matter. It all adds up to something. There's going to be wins and losses, and that's part of it. It doesn't mean you get to just drop it and not show up to the next game. Like you need to use those losses as fuel for future wins, learn from it, move forward. And I think that, in sports people expect results, right? Like ultimately, whether you're a fan or a player, you're expecting that your team is going to show up year after year, smash last year's records, do better this year. I don't know, and it's kind of an illogical fallacy when you think about it. Like it doesn't actually make sense that we would be better every year consistently, but somehow sports people make that happen. And so I think we can apply some of that logic of if you keep showing up and it's about the process and it's about improvement, eventually that's going to add up to something if you're committed enough and you work hard enough. And that's the logic and the kind of mentality we need to approach climate change.
And why is sports that good connector of just getting people to see how, I guess, might sound like David Simon, I guess how all the pieces fit when it comes to just influencing, sustainable living and sustainable business practices. Why is sports the vessel for that?
I think sports is the vessel. I mean, so it was my vessel. I guess I'll start with that. I grew up in, skiing in Eastern Ontario and Quebec. And now I'm watching the mountains I grew up on, not opening until January, which is just absurd. Like when I was little, you definitely had, my birthday is the beginning of December. We definitely were skiing my birthday weekend every year. And that's definitely not happening anymore. You're lucky if you get Christmas. And then, as soon as March break is done, they're wrapping up. You're not getting April skiing anymore. And watching that happen, and then I did a season abroad in France and saw those mountains starting to melt in front of my eyes. I realized that sport for a lot of people, especially in North America, where we both are right now, sport and physical activity is what brings people outside. That's your introduction to the great outdoors in a lot of cases. Not always, but in a lot of cases, that's what's getting you out there. It's your soccer game, or it's your bike ride, or it's your skiing, or it's your golf, or your pond hockey, or whatever. And so if we can use that opportunity when people are already outside and they're in a good headspace and they're thinking about things a little more creatively than they would if they're sitting at a desk, in a classroom or in an office, then we can maybe have a bigger conversation about hey, we need to protect this backyard of ours. And there's a responsibility in that. And there's an opportunity to have kind of a cool and meaningful conversation around it without it being life and death stakes, because that's the other thing the climate people will do is they'll be like, oh, people are dying in this part of the world. And that is true. And that's awful. But that's a real fast way to shut people down because it's too hard to take that on. So when you talk about climate science and you're just making it about numbers, that doesn't really work. If you make it about life and death stakes all the time, people start tuning out. If you make it about polar bears, that's great, but they're not relatable. Like a hockey team is relatable. So I think sport is just that relatable thing. Everyone kind of has a connection to it somehow, some way.
Yeah, it's how far off or how fair is it to say that you're sort of showing that, hey, this fun thing might be the spark, so to speak. Maybe that's a bad verb on my part when I think, because I'm reading Fire Weather by John Vaillant right now.
Oh, yeah, great book.
But
yeah, I mean, look, sport, I kind of am at the point where I want people to be thinking about this. And if their way in is sport, great. Let's talk about it there. And it has been for a lot of people. I mean, if you think about even the C-suite, right? The execs at a lot of big companies in North America, 95% of C-suite executives have a pass to their local golf course. Just think about that for a second. That is immense potential to influence people. If you talk about, hey, by the way, your golf course is maybe going away, not going to be tenable in 20 years because it'll have too much drought or too much flood, depending on where you are. It'll be too hot to play, whatever it is. If that's the hook, if that's what's going to get people interested and engaged, great, let's go there.
Yeah, and what that was golf was actually, and I do not golf, and frankly, I'm amazed. But I want to meet that. I want to meet someone from the 5% of C-suite executives who doesn't golf because
Yeah.
that I like their style. But I did want to ask. How was golf sort of an example of people when they saw how climate change directly threatened, their pastime? They were like, "Oh, okay, we better adapt here." Like
Yeah.
how
So I have a whole, almost a whole chapter on golf because it's such a big one. And, it takes up roughly the size of most of South America, like combined. We think about all the golf courses around the world and how much space they take up, like just a huge amount of space. And what I open that chapter with, and I'm going to tell readers to go and read it. But I open with Donald Trump protecting his golf courses from climate change and specifically sea level rise. And he's looking at maps with his team of Ireland and Scotland, two Atlantic islands that all of his courses there are like on the sea, and they are, and they're stunning. Like they are beautiful courses, idyllic. They hire a lot of people. It's like a boon for the local economy. And it's not an exaggeration to say it might be the most important business in that town. So to lose that from an economic standpoint would be like catastrophic. At the same time, they initially proposed 28-kilometer seawall in one place, which is you can imagine just how monstrous that would look on that shoreline. It would wreck the coastal views from the golf course, but it would also just cause a lot of damage to that natural environment.
Probably killed a lot of animals.
A lot of animals. Yeah, all the animals that would migrate kind of along the beach, all the crabs and small animals and a lot of birds, it would totally bifurcate that whole ecosystem. Anyway, it got knocked down by the local planning committee. They came back to the table over and over trying to repropose different versions of this. But that just kind of goes to show when you make it about the things they care about, and in this case, it's golf, that's sticky in a way that, some of these kind of intangible numbery pieces, sciencey pieces that come in the news are not as sticky and harder to kind of grapple with for people.
Yeah. I kind of blew me away because I just, I don't want to stereotype because lots of people enjoy that activity, but it was a very good example of people saying, okay, here's, our the thing that we define our fun, use to define our fun and get exercises. And like I say, they have sort of adapted. What was maybe another good example from the book that showed people saying, okay, here's a task, and we're going to make, or here's the threat to our our sports club or to our activity, and we're going to make this small adjustment so we can keep doing it.
Yeah. So another good one that I like to bring out is the Kenyan runners. So I spent some time in Kenya, which, for those who haven't been, Kenya is a beautiful country, but it is right on the equator. So it gets really hot in the summertime. I was there in the summer. It gets really hot. They've been in a drought for going on 6 years now, persistent drought. It's impacting how much food availability there is. The government has been rolling back a bunch of policy that they previously made around we're not allowing GMO foods anymore. And now they're going to allow it again because there's such a food crisis. So you can the scale of it is incredible. And the runners there, if you have watched the Olympics or a marathon in the last few years, you might have noticed that the podium tends to be runners from Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea. They absolutely dominate the distance sport. And what we found when we went there is they are running into serious issues because of the heat and the drought. And so the heat is impacting their sleep. It's impacting when they can train. They used to train twice a day. So kind of right around breakfast time and then right around 4 p.m. So kind of before your dinner. They can't do that anymore. There is no running at 4 p.m. in that heat. That just doesn't work at all. So they're waking up earlier than they used to run earlier in the morning. And then they're running into the evening. And that really messes with their sleep schedule, what they can do during the day, because really during the day, the option is sit inside and do nothing. There's no cross training. There's no nothing. You can't do it. Mm-hmm. And they also are having to adapt where they train because part of how this country has become so successful in running is they have these amazing clay roads. And there's it's hard to think of a better surface to run on because it's more forgiving than pavement, kind of similar to like that artificial track material that we have here in Canada, but it's naturally occurring, and they can just go for miles and miles on these roads, and they do, and they don't get injured because the road surface is so good that they're not getting pounding injuries. So their knees, their hips are spared, except that the drought has made those roads rock solid. So they're now having all kinds of issues with where they can run because they are having to like send trucks ahead of them on the road. Like the coaches are driving trucks for the elites, like the lower levels can't afford this, but for the elite athletes, a truck will drive ahead and pour water on the road ahead of them to soften it a little so that they're not getting injured, because they're seeing injury rates go up, especially among the younger athletes. And that's really scary for a country whose whole athletic identity is built into running. That's like if you told Canadians we're not going to have ice hockey anymore, which, by the way, that might be part of the conversation pretty soon. But that's what it feels like to Kenyans.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned in the book, I think the number of days that you can skate on a pond is probably about half as many as it might have been 30 years ago, I think. Yeah.
And like I grew up in a family that like, we were all girls. We didn't play hockey, but we definitely learned to skate. Like you learn to skate as soon as you can walk, you're in skates. That's, how it works in our family. And I think that's like a pretty common experience for kids in Canada. Like you learn to skate when you're little, you push those little red sleds around the ice, or some parent drags you around the ice. And increasingly that's going away, and it's going away for a number of reasons. And it's not just climate change. We have to acknowledge that like our population is getting much more diverse. There's just like more sports that are getting more attention, like soccer and basketball, which 30 years ago, like didn't get that kind of attention. But skating in particular is getting harder and harder to do. Like there's fewer outdoor rinks. That's most kids' introduction because it's cheap. If you've got to pay for ice time for your 2-year-old to learn to skate, like I don't know a lot of parents that are going to do that. Whereas if you can just go to the ODR and put your kids in skates and like they can learn that way for free, that's a much better option for a lot of families. It makes it affordable. It gets kids into the sport and creates that pipeline of interest. So I'm in Toronto. We don't have a single skating rink in the city that's not artificially assisted anymore. Not one. And that's kind of sad. It's kind of sad. Like not one of them is just kind of classic hose and ice anymore. Like they're all artificially assisted. And that's kind of a trend that's starting, unfortunately, to roll across the country.
Yeah. And I'm flashing back to my own childhood in Eastern Ontario. We had a pond out back that we skated on, but I'm sure my sister would have loved to have gotten her kids out there. And I don't think it's probably never going to happen. Now, Madeleine, we should clarify, when you were traveling for research in the book, I think you purchased carbon offsets. How does that sort of work to sort of assuage, worries about contributing to the issue that, you're writing about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I travel a lot for my job. I'm a fieldwork researcher, which means my research happens in the field. I don't have like a lab at U of T where I'm a prof that is dedicated to like having my research participant. That's not how it works. I'm actually in the field taking air quality data and humidity data and weather data, and then matching it to, biophysical data that we're seeing in athletes kind of in context. And you can't really do that without going to a place. That said, I'm hyper aware that there is a huge consequence for the environment to that kind of work. And it's something I've grappled with for years, and I haven't, to be totally honest, quite figured out how to square it. The best I've come up with so far is I won't go to a place unless there's more than one reason to be there. So, when I go to Kenya, I'm collecting my data and doing my research, but also I was meeting with the UN and setting up the Sports for Nature project. And also I had meetings with local athletics organizations to help them build out heat policies and things that have stuck. So I will only go somewhere if I've got more than one reason to be there. And then the other part of it is I will offset wherever I fly. It's not perfect. It's like I call it a medium solution in the book. It's very medium. And that's kind of where we are right now. I think with sports and with a lot of things, like if you travel for leisure or for sport, or if you're, driving your kid back and forth to school or to their activities or whatever it is, the first thing that comes to mind for me is like, there is no individual solution to a huge systematic problem. So like us making these individual changes is important for the sake of contributing to being part of the solution. But me individually not flying is not going to fix climate change. What I can do is be part of solutions wherever those opportunities present themselves. One of them is offsets. And so I worked with an organization that's women-owned, Indigenous run out in BC on Haida Gwaii Nation. They are protecting a huge amount of forest. It's one of the only wildlife restoration projects in Canada that's doing that work. It's one of the only ones led by Indigenous folks. So I spent a lot of time interviewing different projects, trying to figure out what I would contribute to and how that would work. And even with all that work, it's still very much a medium solution. It's not perfect. It doesn't eliminate the fact that I've produced a ton of emissions through my work. And I try to just give myself a little grace with that. And I give everybody grace. Like if you have a certain house or you drive a certain car or whatever, like that's fine. You do you. But wherever you can make choices to be part of the solution, make those choices. That's all. I think if we all do that a little more, we get there.
Yeah, I think the term you used for that was I think hypocrisy trap. People are always like, well, you choose to participate. It's the you choose to participate in society meme, is it not?
Right. No, it is. It is. And it's also like, the statistic is that by the age of 4, you have contributed more emissions than you would ever be able to remove by yourself. And that is every person in North America. So here's the thing, right? We can't blame ourselves for participating in society that was designed around a certain lifestyle. And especially in a place like Canada, where like it gets really hot in the summer. Like I am a person who like, I get heat syncope. Like I'm part of why I'm interested in this work is like, I'm a person who will faint if I get too hot. Like I will just faint. And so air conditioning is like not really a negotiable thing. Like I need that. And in the winter, like I'm not trying to tell any Canadian to live without heat. That's just a no-go as far as I'm concerned. We live in a system that is how it is, but we can make choices. Like I don't drive a car in the city. We take public transit and our bikes everywhere. I don't eat meat. Like, so I've like made choices where I can, but again, it's like you make the choices you can make. If some of your lifestyle requires you to emit pollution, like, yeah, that's everybody. Welcome to life on Earth. But be part of the solutions where you can. So show up at the voting ballot with that in mind and figure out who's coming up with policy to make your choices easier. Because again, we can't blame people for choices they don't have. If you're driving somewhere because there's no good public transit where you are, or it's just not an option because if you've got a kid and a stroller and groceries and all these things, like there's a lot of good reasons to drive your car or take a flight or do what you got to do. So I'm not mad at individuals for living their lives. I just, wherever you can make changes, make them.
And I'll just say as an aside before I get to the next question, I live in Hamilton, and one of the biggest things that sort of citizen advocacy things has been trying to get a maximum heat bylaw in apartment buildings. There's a minimum heat bylaw. It has to be at least 15 Celsius in the winter, but people are like, do something. And they're pressuring to, at least get like, I guess I can ask you about that. Like just being able to get out of the heat that leads to, must lead to that leads to savings for the healthcare system because it's not escalating medical conditions for people. I'm showing that I was an English major here, Madeleine.
No, bang on. That's exactly right. So when the body experiences heat, essentially what it's going to do, we're very inefficient beings when it comes to cooling ourselves down. Our bodies are just not very good at that. When you are sitting in ambient heat, basically what we're looking at is there a high enough gradient between your body temperature and the ambient temperature? If your body temperature is colder than the ambient temperature, so like as soon as the temps get into like the feels like mid 30s and up, you are going to be functionally cooler than your environment. That's not good because all of a sudden you're not able to release heat. Like, so you're going to send all of that heat, you're going to send blood to your skin in order to sweat, in order to try to release some of that heat in your body. But if the temperature around you is hotter than your body, it's not going to go anywhere. And so your temperature just continues to climb. If that continues and isn't interrupted with some cooling, usually either a cold tank, so like get into your bathtub with like cool water, not cold, but cool, drink water, get some electrolytes in, a cold towel goes a long way. But if you can't get your body temperature down in that environment, it can lead to catastrophic outcomes, especially for people who might be children and elderly are especially at risk, pregnant women, anybody who has any underlying condition and takes medication. Most medications, even your standard like Tylenol and Advil, is going to change the way your body processes heat. Our thermal processing systems are like very temperamental. Excuse the pun, right? And so if you're on any kind of medication, like you probably have some lack of ability, like slightly lesser ability to monitor your heat. And so anyone with pre-existing conditions, people who are disabled, people who have injuries, like that list is long. And yeah, it's really important that we have upper limits on indoor air quality and air temperature so that we make sure that people are not exacerbating whatever issues they may already have, because you're absolutely right. That is only going to drive up health costs.
And now with sports, and we've talked about, hearing about animals, hearing about, numbers people can kind of just glaze over. But how is, and it's in the book, how is advocacy from families who's had a son or a daughter, die from heat stroke helped get the message across to, sports parents about, that heat stroke is entirely avoidable?
Yeah. So heat stroke is entirely avoidable, right? I think that's like the bottom line for me is like, this doesn't need to happen to anybody. When it comes to what I described before is called ambient heat stroke, it's when you're just sitting there and your body temp is climbing because the environment around you is climbing. When you work out, you produce a ton of additional heat on top of what your body's normally going to do, right? So if you're moving your body, about 75% of the energy that's being used by your body to try to move is just a heat byproduct. You're only actually functionally using 25% of that energy to like produce the function of movement. 75% is burned off as a heat byproduct. So you are increasing your body temp just by moving around. And if you've gone for a run in hot weather, you know this, your body temp is climbing fast and you're huffing and puffing really quick. Again, if your body temp starts getting into a range where it doesn't have enough of a gradient with the ambient air temperature, like we're getting into trouble zone. I had the I don't want to say the pleasure. It was really sad. I was honored and humbled by a group of families who agreed to sit with me in separate interviews and tell me about the worst day of their lives, which was losing their children to exertional heat stroke. And that looked like, in many cases, an athlete collapses on a field or starts to throw up, often is usually the first kind of big sign, so like severe nausea. And usually when these things happen, initially, it looks like cramping, it looks like fatigue, it looks like sweating and some nausea. And a coach, if a coach knows what they're doing, they're going to identify that it's really hot outside and an athlete has some symptoms, and they're going to tell that athlete, okay, take a minute, cool down. Here's a cooling towel. Let's get you some water. Let's get you some into the shade. Go back in 5 minutes when you feel better. In these cases of families who've lost children, that intervention didn't happen. It's the simplest intervention in the world, but it didn't happen because one of two things. Either the coach and the trainers misinterpreted it as the athlete just having a really rough practice, like maybe they went a little too hard, which is pretty innocuous. And a lot of those symptoms do kind of look like the symptoms of just having a really hard practice. Or they noticed the symptoms, but they didn't act on them for whatever reason. Usually that like there's a bit of a macho attitude around, especially team sports, especially men's sports, where there's like a tough it out attitude, right? Like you can get through this, your teammates are getting through it, keep going. And so for one of those reasons, or a combination of reasons, the athlete didn't get that break, didn't get the cooling. And so their body temp continued to climb as they continued to play. They experienced, so it takes about half an hour for initial symptoms to get to a point where you're experiencing heat stroke, and heat stroke can be catastrophic and has
deaths. We're talking
about death, right? And in some cases, it led to major lawsuits, and in my opinion, rightfully so. Huge lawsuits have been landed on coaches' laps around negligence. There's been murder charges laid against coaches in the U.S. around this a couple of times now, a couple of cases where athletes died on a coach's watch, and other athletes after on the team were like, that athlete that passed away had said they weren't feeling well, identified it with the coach, the intervention didn't happen, or the coach blew them off, and then the kid died. And having the parents share these stories very vocally, very emphatically in the news and with the local sports commissions is starting to move the needle. It's starting to be effective in actually having heat policies drawn up in almost every state in the US now. But it still isn't solving the fact that that coach needs to actually do something when the symptoms show up. And that's really tricky because that's a cultural piece, right? Like that means that the kid has to say, or the athlete has to say, I'm not feeling okay, which I don't know that many 17-year-old boys that want to say that out loud. So that can be a tricky piece. And then the coach has to actually know what to do with that and implement a protocol. So a lot of pieces have to go right, but none of them are hard, I think, is the key. And so no athlete should die of heat exhaustion and then heat stroke, but increasingly we're seeing that happen. We've had more than 50 cases of deaths since the turn of this century, which is huge. And those are just the ones that have been confirmed to be from heat-related illness. There are hundreds of cases where it was suspected, but because it read as basically anything else, like I said, these symptoms will just look like a hard practice to many because it read as basically anything else, and they didn't put heat as the cause of death. It didn't get tracked in those numbers. So there's hundreds more cases where it's highly suspected.
Yeah, and when I've heard you speak about this on other podcasts like The End of Sports, I think I cross-referenced it with advocacy around brain injuries. Maybe this is going back a few years. The Ontario Hockey League got Nick Kyprios, commentator and a former player whose career had a career-ending brain injury, and he was saying, hey, they had him broadcast a message to players, hey, this, it's not worth it to. And how much are we going to, how like I say, how important is it to have that agency and that voice from the sports people around heat related illnesses, I guess.
It's really important. And at the highest levels, we see less of this than we do with youth sport and like college level, right? And a college athlete, if they're being impacted by heat stroke, usually it happens right at the beginning of the season. So unless you're like the star of a team and you're already got name recognition, you're not going to be a person, like it's not going to be a Nick Kyprios who people actually know, right? Like that's the challenge. Like there's a reason it doesn't happen in the NFL. And the reason is most of their training facilities are now indoors. The only team that isn't doing their preseason training indoors is the Chiefs. And they got hit with this last year with some issues nearby. So it's going to, they say that things change by disaster or by design. And I kind of am getting to the point where I think with this one, it's going to be by disaster pretty soon. We've had NFL players die of heat stroke. There's been pro soccer players die of this. There's Amy Steele, an indoor sport, netball, which is like, I guess, British and Australian basketball without a board behind it.
Yeah. We used to call it European handball and they would get mad.
But she had heat stroke, a career-ending episode of heat stroke indoors because it wasn't air conditioned and the temps were sky high that day. And like they were asking questions, the athletes were asking questions before the game started around like, should we even be playing? And the coaches were like, yeah, we're going to go ahead. So she's been very vocal in Australia, and that's helped to push the needle a little bit. Joe Root, who's like a very famous cricketer from England, he's had a huge bout of this, and he's been loud about it, and that's helped in cricket. But we haven't seen an athlete with big enough stature from, your American football, your soccer, et cetera, who've survived an episode like this and who are of high enough caliber come out and turn around and start to put out the PSAs. So that might happen soon. I would expect it will happen soon, but we haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. And I wondered how fair is it to say like the generation of athletes? I mean, I'm, who are, I guess, young enough to be be my children. I'm 47 years old, are really aware of this and are like pushing the, senior leadership this is where I can say, okay, boomer, in their sports to, you're going to have to make these accommodations, or, before you, as you say, a disaster happens.
Yeah, I think so. Here's the thing, right? If you're an athlete and you're at a high level and you've succeeded to this point, usually it's because somebody has recognized that you either have extraordinary talent or you're very coachable and hardworking and amenable to following whatever the coaches say, right? And that's where this run of friction is. It's kind of like and it's hard to remember the time before concussions were kind of in the public conscience, but like wind back the clock 20 years. And it wasn't like we were aware of concussions, of course we were, but it wasn't as big a thing until we started losing kids to concussions. And like the Rowan's Law happened in Ontario with rugby player who died, a 13-year-old girl, right? Like there were some big kind of moments that woke us up to it. With heat, it's so easy to pass off as anything else that it's harder to get the story. It's harder to make a big splash about it. But every case that has come up, and I talk in the book about Jordan McNair because it was such a flash in the pan, like huge case in the US. And it was, Maryland, a very good football program. Jordan was like a rock star freshman on the team, like very highly sought after, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a case where like the parents were able to really push a big campaign around it. But that's rare, right? Like the last time we had that kind of flash in the pan happen was Corey Stringer, and that was 2003. His NFL player played on the Vikings and died of heat. But people forget and they move on. So I think that the more we see incidents, and especially with kids, the more this is going to come up. But it's harder at the pro levels because their solution so far is like, oh, we're just going to move inside and like pretend this isn't happening.
Yeah, and I did hear you say, well, you're still breathing indoor air. But I sort of, when you bring up the kids, and by the way, I obviously remember every time August rolls around and NFL training camps open, I always think of Corey Stringer because I am a Minnesota Vikings fan, and his jersey number was 77, and that's my birth year, and also happens to be the last year the Vikings ever played in the Super Bowl. See, I'm not one of those sports fans who expects things to get better every year. I just expect them to not get as bad as fast as they did the year before. But I wanted to ask, when you were looking at like youth sports, what is the right balance to, continue to have them and recover them and rebuild them, especially that chapter you have about the town in California where they, had to have bring back football after they lost a whole season to wildfires. And I actually have, someone I know who had to do the same thing in Fort McMurray after the fires in 2016 that John Valant wrote about. Like, what is the right balance, I guess, for recovering them in a mentally healthful way? Yeah.
So in that chapter, I talk about a high school football team, very much the center of this small community in Paradise, California, Paradise High. They are iconic in that area. Like, it's hard to overstate how important this football team is to this town, right? Like that's your Friday night entertainment all through the fall every year. That's how they keep, boys engaged, parents passing the traditions to kids, et cetera. Like it's an institution. And when the fires rolled around in 2018, razed the whole town to the ground. And I talk through this from the perspective of the coach. I actually sat with the coach for an afternoon and walked through that whole sequence with him around the town. And it's shocking, like what happens when your town burns down. So I share that. And then I get into, here's how the return to play happened. And this is where sometimes things get overlooked. The priority in a lot of cases, and this is true, like we're doing a project right now, a research project, my team and I at U of T with Sport North up in the Northwest Territories around like, how do they return after their fires? Because they have quite a few as well. And what tends to happen is you say, right, let's get back to normal as fast as possible. Now, in some respects, that's right. You want to get kids engaging with each other, playing things that feel familiar, having some kind of a routine that can be really important. It can provide structure. Sports also can provide a huge social system for these kids. The coaching staff were able to provide a lot of support to kids who, in some cases, like mom and dad were living in another town because like they had just up and left after the fire thinking we're going to relocate. And so the kid is commuting in to have some semblance of normal. And that's really valuable, that semblance of normal. However, there's a balance between providing that sense of community, that sense of normal, that physical activity outlet, all those things, that's all good things. And the intensity that comes with competition and being kind of the center of the town's attention in a grievous moment. And in this case, the team had a very successful season coming back, so kudos to them. But a lot of things went, I guess, unattended to is the best way to put it. Many athletes on the team were not getting proper meals because of the displacement. Many of them were homeless functionally. They were like living on friends' couches or in the back of their truck. There were many athletes who experienced insomnia. Like most of the guys on the team had some level of insomnia. It was something like 80% of the people in that town experienced months of insomnia after that event. You can imagine the horror of like watching your town burn to the ground and you're trying to like drive out of town with walls of flames on both sides of the highway. That's going to stir up some stuff, right? And that like, this is not about being mentally tough. Like that's just like, no person should experience that. Like that's just terror. So it makes a lot of sense that there would be fallout in the form of kind of mental health issues and sleep issues and, stability around where they're living and where they're getting their nutrients and their food, etc. And so they came back to football, but the football program isn't equipped to deal with all of that. And so they didn't. And that meant that, kids were getting injured and not bringing it up. There were issues with like kids not actually eating properly. A couple of the coaches landed in the hospital from various stress-related heart issues. Like it was a bit of a mess. And on the front end of it, and the way it got reported by like the columnists out of the LA Times was like, this is a success story and they came back and what a great outcome. And when I was there and talking to some of these athletes and the, people in the community, it was like, actually, that's not exactly how it went down. Like, yeah, they had a successful season and that's great. But there was a lot of collateral damage to coming back and putting that much pressure on a team of like 16, 17, 18-year-old boys. So we have to figure out how to be a little gentler about our return to play in such a way that we provide opportunities to play, but maybe don't jump right back into a super competitive season. Maybe it's like, okay, we're going to like play exposition games this year. And then we're going to rejoin a league later when things are a little more stable, when people have more than one t-shirt to train in, because that's all they had on their belt when they left. Like it sounds simple. And for some, it sounds maybe harsh to like say, don't compete right away, but competition adds a whole dimension of stress to these kids in a moment where they definitely don't need more stress. But there would have been ways, and this was what I was talking about with them. It's what we're talking about in the Northwest Territories is like, we can have sport and have fun and have all the benefits and drop the competitive push a little bit or phase it in slowly. And that might be a healthier return to play protocol moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds similar to rehabbing injury. And jumping that up to the professional level, obviously with COVID-19, leagues had to adapt. And then it just in 2020, around 2022, everything flipped to like, okay, like actually maybe even late 2021 in some places, it was just like, we have to get back to normal. What is this? What is that? What does that say about, I guess, maybe human nature and what we're sometimes not willing to do with when we're presented with a public health emergency, which is how I kind of view climate change, or I've come to view it since reading up on it in the last 6-7 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, all of the reasons that parents would put their kids into sports, all the reasons that we all love sports, can be preserved with a few tweaks that make sure that the people who are actually doing the thing, actually playing, are safe. That's what we're talking about. We're just talking about, let's just keep this safe and fun. And competition is like a distant goal for later. Like, we're not saying get rid of it forever. We're just saying phased return.
And you have said, I think there's a lot of people in the world there's a lot of people who don't like my ideas, but the world is on fire. I felt that because most of my ideas, lead balloon with people. But what are some that I mean, obviously you want people to read the book, but when it comes to pro sports, how should they change to sort of get to sustainable business practices?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'll put on the table is I think we need to preserve sports at every level. I'll say that. I'll also say they're going to have to look different in order to be safe, in order to remain fun, and in order to stay within some version of a carbon budget so that we're not blowing our whole carbon budget as a society on things that are not absolutely like need to have. Like I'm happy for the hospital to have a slightly higher carbon budget than my pro sports team because the hospital is saving lives and the sports team is, giving us some fun on a Friday night. So there's levels to this. But with pro sports, there's a few kind of pieces that I think are really important that are not actually even that complicated or hard. The first one is we're going to need to change the way the schedule works. And this is something that for those who follow like Formula One, Max Verstappen made comments about this like 5 days ago. We're recording this the first week of June. Max Verstappen was making comments about this last week about the Formula One schedule next year, saying, hey, like, why are we going all the way around the world like 10 times over on this calendar? That doesn't make any sense. We should be doubling up and having more back-to-back races in places that are close to each other. So we go to, from A to B, B to C, and then back to A, instead of going A to B, back to A, and then A to C, back to A through the calendar. We can do the same thing with pro sports in North America. I think we should. And I think part of that is going to be, maybe more double headers. We saw that work during COVID. It worked just fine. It might mean more regionalized play initially, right? And like that is how both the MLB and the NFL started, for the record. Like we're not suggesting things that we haven't done before. I'm just saying maybe we bring back some of those models. So that during the regular season, you're playing people in your region more often so that there's less travel from like your New York to your Seattle and back. Right. So if New York teams are playing Toronto, Boston, Buffalo, Philly, Washington, DC, like Chicago, like that bubble in the North, great. And then like the Southeast can play each other and they would all have maybe 2 or 3 games against each other in a season and only one with the other teams around the continent.
Yeah, and it's
part of the way there.
Yeah, and it's wild because I'm a Blue Jays fan, obviously, and I think I mentioned it when I was recording the intro. Like this week, their next road trip is 5 hours to 5 hours by plane to Oakland, then 3.5 back to Milwaukee, which isn't even in the same league. No, and it's just like, and then I was like, well, how long would it take to go by train from Oakland to Milwaukee? And it was 63 hours. Yeah, that actually brought me up the example of Ines Fitzgerald, the British runner. What can you she's probably not on the radar of all of our audience. What can you tell me about her little bit of climate rebellion?
So Ines Fitzgerald is like sports' very own Greta Thunberg. She's 17, or she was at the time. I think she's 19 now. She was 17 a couple of years ago when she was named to the British national team to travel to Australia for world championships for cross-country running. And this kid was a dynamo. Like she had just gone against some of the fastest runners in the world at European championships and had been in the top 10. Like she really, at that age, was competing with the best of them and would have been potentially a medal contender in a place like Australia. But she wrote to the British Athletics Council and said, take me off the team. I do not want to be considered for this world championships because it would require flying to Australia and I'm not going to do it for climate reasons. Now, this is a kid who put a lot on the line by doing that. She's still going to have, because she's so extraordinary, she will still have sporting opportunities moving forward. So, and that was probably a calculated decision by her. Like she knows that this isn't her turning down her one shot to, make a splash. But it sent a really strong message to British athletics, to world athletics, to the organizers of the event that by putting it in a place like Australia, you're asking literally everybody except the Australians to fly a very long distance to get there. Whereas if it got hosted, for example, in Europe, then, North Americans are flying to Europe, which is way less far than going to Australia. And all of the Europeans are already nearby. Most can come on the train. Africa just comes north, Asia comes west, and we're there. Mm-hmm. So the total carbon footprint of any event that would be in like a Paris, which is what the Olympics are this summer, would be measurably less than like a Japan or an Australia or something far-flung. And it sent shockwaves through the sports system. There was a couple weeks there when she made that announcement where the sports system kind of sat back and was like, oh, are we about to get slammed by athletes on the regular? Now that didn't happen, but it did spark way more interest among other athletes who took notice. And I think we're going to start to see more advocacy like that moving forward. So hats off to her. Hugely brave move to make at the beginning of your pro career. And I hope we see more like it.
And how does that all link up? I'm obviously, we want to obviously going to have to reduce the the carbon output of the sports industry, but we're also having this wonderful moment where women's sports is breaking out big time. So how do we what needs to happen to make sure that those two things can actually go together? The gender equity improves, which means more teams, more travel.
Yeah.
I mean, the big WNBA thing was, hey, we get charter flights now, but you're also just moving. Because how does it, I'm stammering a little bit. How do you make sure those two goals are actually in alignment? Is my question.
Yeah. So the way I think about this is that if you imagine that every entity on the planet, every person, every organization, every country has a carbon budget, and the men's pro sports organizations of the world, or specifically in North America, where we tend to have a lot of money and do a lot of flashy things, they've blown their carbon budget many times over the years. And they're at a point where they need to be measurably reducing their draw on emissions every year. Now, many of these leagues have made commitments to that effect. They've joined the Race to Zero. They've committed to having emissions by 2030 and going net zero by 2040. They're thinking about it. Are they on track? Not quite, but they're thinking about it. They're aware that they need to reduce. On the women's side, it's a bit of a different equation because they haven't actually had the chance yet, really, to get anywhere near what their carbon budget might be. And you also have to imagine that, I also don't think that the women need to adopt everything that the men have done. For example, I think men and women would be served just fine on a train if it were going from Montreal to Ottawa, or if they were on a train from Boston to New York, or New York to Washington, or Washington to Philly. Like, there are huge sections of the country in North America, in the US and in Canada, that are well served by train systems and ground transport, where whether you're men's or women's pro sport, you could be on the ground just as easily, still get there in that day. If we've agreed as society, which I guess we have, that it's cool for an athlete to fly from New York to Seattle and then back the next day for a game, surely that 5 hours would be just fine on the ground for, going like it's 5 hours from like Boston to Philly. So
yeah, we have such a challenge with geography.
Right.
Yeah. And I just thought I don't want to have double standards, but I mean, there's going to be a women's pro soccer league starting in Canada, and I instantly saw that the Calgary team already signed up with like an oil and gas company as their like sponsor. And I was just like, ooh.
Yeah.
So what's the best way to say, hey, I'm glad this league is happening, but please don't do that.
Exactly that. No, that's exactly what we say. I think it's reasonable to say that we want the women's game to have every opportunity of success. We also think that all athletes are totally fine in transit for 5 hours, if that's what we've kind of agreed to based on how schedules have traditionally worked. And that 5 hours can just as easily happen on the ground for some transport. And when you're looking at, sponsors and portfolios of who's your investors are, like, you probably also want to be thinking about what makes sense in the long term. And no matter how fast or slow the curve goes on this, like, the curve of change is bending only in one direction, and that's to be more sustainable in this country. So Calgary, like, that's going to be a bad look in about 7 minutes from now. And they will catch heat for it, I think. And it's going to be a shame, like, that you start up your team and immediately you're catching heat. And I know that they will say, we need the money to come from somewhere. And my response is, great. Yes. But you also are telling the world that you are going to be a beacon for young girls and women participating in the sports world. You do not need to be engaging with companies who don't have the best interest of people's health in mind.
Yeah, well, he pretty much nails it. Well, Madeleine, I kind of want to wind down. I've taken, and we appreciate every minute you've given us. I always like to close out on a section I call "Take or Light," which is
Okay.
inspired by a Canadian comedy I saw in a theater. Yes, that's actually possible. Because I read up on on your sort of background. I did want to ask. Just some fun questions to close out.
Sure.
First of all, this has been, this is heavy stuff. And
Yeah.
so what's the best thing you can do when you're hosting your first dinner party? And what's the biggest rookie mistake people make when they host their first dinner party?
Oh, okay. I think
I totally split.
The best thing you can do when hosting your first dinner party is have good guests. I feel like everything else is secondary. Dinner party is like the dinner is not important. The party is the important part. Like, have good company. That's number one. But from a sustainability standpoint, best thing you can do with the dinner party is introduce everyone at your table to something local. So, I'm in Ontario, like we are in strawberry season and they are really good, my friend. Like, make sure strawberries are part of your meal somehow. Maybe it's part of the dessert. That's kind of what I would say on dinner parties. I love dinner parties. I don't know if you saw that on my website, but like I
did.
love dinner parties. Yeah.
And what's the rookie mistake people make when they're getting into hosting something like that?
Taking on too much. Like, I've seen people try to, go with the most elaborate menu and the most fancy thing, and like maybe making something they've never made before. Like, that's not the point. People are coming to hang out with you. That's why they're there. Having great food is a bonus, and it should be part of it, but don't overdo it. Like, no one's mad at like a great barbecue. Nobody is mad about like a simple dish made well. So there's no need to overdo it.
What's your best story about, I guess you used to ski, I guess, when you were growing up. What's your best skiing story?
Ooh, when I was maybe 10, my sister and I were on a chairlift together, and we could never figure out like the chairlift bar, like who's going to put it up and down and how that's going to work. And we would always try to race each other to put it up at the top when you're about to jump off the lift. And we both went to grab it, and I grabbed it and pulled it up and like chipped the full front of her tooth off. And so I'm like, I did it. I beat you to it. And I'm like sliding off and just like, like bloody.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Now, what is the best mascot? A golden gopher, a thunderbird, or a Gigi?
Ooh, I think Gigi, just because of the cheer that so when I went to undergrad at Ottawa U, the Gigi is originally for Garnet and Gray, G and G. That's where originally that came from. But the Gigi, like GEE, is the first horse out of the gates. That's when all the universities adopted animal mascots, they went to a horse, first horse out of the gate. And I just think it's hilarious because no one knows what it is and it doesn't make a ton of sense. And the Carleton Ravens like to chant what the F's a Gigi at U Ottawa whenever they play each other. And so, having been an athlete at U Ottawa when I was there, that one's extra special to me.
Oh, what sport did you do there?
Water polo.
Oh, water polo. Oh, neat. Okay.
Yeah.
I was actually Ottawa's football broadcaster for about 6 years.
Okay.
Probably around the time, overlapped when you were a student. I had the in for a GGTD touchdown call. So, and obviously I did Carleton too. I had a touchdown call for that, but I didn't get to use it as often. Now, and what's sort of next for you? I mean, obviously writing a book's a huge thing.
Yeah.
But what's sort of next for you that you feel comfortable telling our audience about?
Ooh, so I've just spent about a year. So when I wrote the book, and you kind of said at the beginning of these funny answers or these quick answers, when I wrote the book, I found it massively depressing, if I'm being totally honest. Like, I distilled it and tried to make it less depressing for the reader. Like, it's heavy for sure. I'm not going to tell you it's not heavy, but hopefully it's not super depressing because I try to include a lot of solutions and, good things. But I was buried in it for years writing it. And so I came out on the other end thinking like, I need a good news story. And so I went and found one. So I spent a whole year traveling all across Canada, visiting elementary schools, high schools, university classrooms, and basically pitching young people on like, what would it look like if we got everything right by 2080? And the project was actually sponsored by McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, where you are. I was named a Future of Canada Fellow to go do it. And so my next kind of exciting project is that we have a whole collection of over 100 pieces of art made in these workshops by kids that's going to be shown at the Paper Mill galleries in Toronto in August and September of this year in 2024. And then it's going to move to McMaster for the fall term. And so I'm really excited for the world to see some of the ideas these kids came up with, because kids have good ideas and we really need to ask them more.
That's amazing. What age range are we talking about with the children who contributed these ideas and artwork?
So we went with 9 to 25. And the idea was that everybody who is in it will be of retirement age by the time 2080 rolls around, or just about. So the 9-year-olds will be just coming up on their retirement age, but everyone else will kind of still be in it. And the idea is that like, that's a far enough timeline that anything kind of is in play. Like between now and 2080, like we got 50 some years, like you can accomplish a lot in 50 some years, but it's not so far that it feels completely unrelatable. For most people who did it, it was like, oh, you might be a grandparent. Like that feels kind of real. You have some idea of what being a grandparent is. You have a grandparent probably. So it was more relatable. So yeah, so it was a cool project. And the ideas and some of the art is like, I'm so excited for people to see it because kids have great ideas.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend my sister take her 7-year-old and her 3-year-old. And now just one sort of last thing, like after writing all this, I've heard you say you weren't much of a sports fan. Did this make you a bit more of a sports fan?
I mean, in the period of writing all of this, I met my now husband, married him. He is a basketball guy, but grew up playing hockey and baseball. And so like we now have sports on a regular basis. I have become more of a sports fan, I will say, for all Toronto sports except the Maple Leafs, because I will forever be my father's daughter and a Habs fan. But still not, like I'm not a diehard at all. Like I love it for the community it brings, for the vibes. Like it's fun to watch a team, to follow who's, on the ice or on the court or whatever it is. But I'm not like your standard sports fan. I can't rattle off all the stats and I don't know the history. And I just, I'm very much a fair weather fan.
And that's the best kind to be. Well, Madeleine Orr, this has been outstanding. Probably kept you a little bit longer than I intended to. Apologies for that. So the book for our listeners, it's Warming Up: How Climate Change is Changing Sport, and it was released May 14th by Bloomsbury Sigma and distributed by Raincoast Books in Canada. And Madeleine, best of luck with everything.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.